Okay, we're back. Let me make sure everybody's on board here. Okay, we're back in the Administrative Hearings Office hearing in the court's reference to the State Water Resources Control Board and City of Marina versus RMC Lonestar. It is March 1st, 2023, and it's just after 1:30 in the afternoon, and I apologize for my delay in getting back. I'm not sure whether we have a separate recording or whether it's a continuation of this morning's recording, so that's why I wanted to just make sure to state that at the beginning so that the recording is identified. All right. So during the break at noon, I did talk with my staff about this question of model scenarios. And here's what I've concluded we should do, or I'm going to ask you to do. First of all, I do continue to encourage the modeling experts, and frankly, you have been very good at conferring and trying to reach consensus on issues, and I certainly want you to continue to do that. And I do encourage you to see if you can reach consensus on one, I'll say, set of modeling parameters that can be used for the no project, no sigma implementation scenario going forward, with the understanding that that may be different from the calibration scenario. And something that I think is worth considering, at least we thought might be worth considering, is whether by extending the calibration period by a year into 2022, you would be able to incorporate some lower groundwater levels. I don't know how fast the groundwater levels responded. I do know 2022 was a very dry year. And whether that can address this issue of the fact that the 2019 to 2021 calibration period may have had higher than average groundwater levels. Apparently there's some disagreement on that. If you cannot reach agreement on one scenario of, as I say, for modeling the no project and no sigma implementation, well, actually it would be for modeling also the project implementation scenarios, then I will ask you to reach agreement on two scenarios, one which presumably would be the calibration scenario, and then the other would be the adjusted with the calibration recharge rates, and then the other would be the scenario with the adjusted recharge rates as may be necessary for addressing the groundwater level issue. And then if that happens, then I will have you run those two scenarios again for the no project scenario and the two CalAm pumping scenarios. So that I think that, and then as I said this morning, I think the best way to proceed is for CalAm. So that, let me back up. That was option A, or potentially options A and B. And then options, the remaining two options, B and C or C and D, will be, one will be CalAm's assumptions for for a plausible sigma implementation scenario, and the other will be Marina Coast and City of Marina's assumptions for a plausible sigma implementation scenario. I hope that you can agree to use the same, I'm going to say, adjusted recharge values if you have to do that scenario B for these two new scenarios, again, so that we have fewer variables between the different scenarios. As I mentioned this morning, we will ask for the model files when you've run those scenarios so we can look at them as well. I don't know whether or not any or all of the relevant groundwater sustainability plans have been already submitted as exhibits, but please make sure. I think, Mr. Burchard, you're shaking your head yes. Does that mean that they all have or some of them have?
They all have.
That would be both the 18400 aquifer subbasin and the Monterey subbasin GSPs?
Yeah, both of the main GSPs have been submitted as exhibits. I'm not sure that like all of the appendixes are in there, but I think the main GSPs, which are I think what you're looking for, are in there.
Okay, good. I just couldn't remember. Thank you.
I agree.
Good. I'm glad you two can agree on something. And it may be depending on the model assumptions for the what I'm calling the Sigma implementation scenarios that you want to submit GSPs if they've been adopted for the other subbasins, like the 4-bay subbasin. I think that's what it's called. At least that's what it used to be called. If there's, I'll just ask, does anybody know if there's a GSP has been adopted for that subbasin yet? Go ahead, Ms. Nelson.
The only the only GSP that's been approved is the 18400 because it's a critically overdrafted subbasin. All the other GSPs are still under review by DWR.
Okay, that's what I was afraid of. Well, or not afraid of. But...
And I think the Seaside Basin, because it was adjudicated, is exempt from having to do a GSP.
Okay. All right. Well, anyway, please, I don't want any more exhibits than necessary, but if some of these other, if there at least are draft or proposed GSPs for some of the other subbasins that are relevant to the assumptions for these Sigma implementation scenarios, then please make sure to submit those so we can understand the basis for the assumptions you're making for those scenarios. So, and let me just finish up and then I'll get to you, Mr. Leffler. I see your electronic hand went up. So the scenarios, no project we've talked about, and Dr. Ye told me or told us this morning that for the 6.4 MGD of production scenario, that's 15.5 MGD of pumping. I did a little math for proportionality. So for the 4.8 MGD of production, I get the pumping is 11.6 MGD. So we will refer to those scenarios by the pumping amounts, but we'll put in parentheses the production amounts just so we all know what's being used for reference. So it looks like we're going to have 9 scenarios and potentially 12 for modeling. And as we said before, even though each side will make develop a set of modeling assumptions for Sigma implementation, obviously I want both sides to run those scenarios so we can do the comparison of the outputs based on your different modeling assumptions. So with that, Mr. Leffler, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick clarification on the GSPs. So when you say adopted, that means, at least to me, that, adopted by the local GSAs and stakeholders and so forth. So, so GSPs have been adopted for all the subbasins, but as Ms. Nilsson said, only one has had time to be reviewed by DWR, and they rendered a decision where they approved it. And then related to that is, DWR directs people to implement their GSPs while they're under review. So they're essentially adopted and implementing them, and then while waiting to hear about approval or any revisions needed.
Okay, so thank you for that clarification. So adopted would be by the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, approved by DWR. So, obviously we've got to work with what we have. We can't wait forever. So to the extent a GSP has been adopted and is relevant to your modeling assumptions for these Sigma implementation scenarios, please make sure we have it in the record. And please, there's obviously shouldn't be any dispute, but let us know who has done what regarding adopting, approving, or whatever for these different GSPs, so I can put that in our report as well. So it's an evolving process, but we'll do what we can with the current state of facts. Okay, so are there any other questions or comments regarding the model scenario issues. We'd had a useful discussion this morning, and again, I mean, I've expressed my concerns about not having more scenarios than we need, particularly if, and I don't know whether these would show significantly different results or not. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't, but obviously, if you can reach consensus on what I'm calling the no sigma implementation scenario, that would be valuable. But if not, we'll have 2 scenarios for that we'll put into our table of scenarios. Okay, any other discussion on that, or should we move forward? We'll go ahead and move forward then. I mentioned before the break, I think the model results formatting, there shouldn't be much dispute on that. I do just want to reemphasize, please try to have your outputs in the same formats so that we can readily compare them. Of course, using the same scenario labels and so forth, so that we can readily compare where there are similarities and where there are differences. And then regarding 9E of the outline, I know it doesn't sound like you've had much joint discussions on this, but are there any comments anyone wants to make on the process going forward for basically trying to assess potential impacts of the CalAm project on MCWD wells and the seawater intrusion front? Okay, well, if not, obviously that's very important. And again, to the extent you can reach consensus on the formatting of your presentations, outline sections and things like that, even if you don't obviously have consensus on the substantive provisions, I really want you to do that as much as possible. So Mr. Wilkins, go ahead.
I just wanted to prompt Dr. Kincaid or Ms. Nelson on this point. And I don't know that we need a long discussion on it, but we've asked them about this issue. My understanding is that without going to a variable density model, it's really difficult to do this, what you're asking. And there's a lot of, I guess, what I understand are, well, I'll call them error bars, whichever route you go. So I do think it's potentially useful for you to at least hear a little teeny bit about this and see if you have any direction for us. And with that, I will punt it to Ms. Nelson or Dr. Kincaid. Again, I'm not trying to testify on it. I just know that there's some uncertainty about how to approach this.
And I assume by this, you mean the modeling or assessment, we'll say, it may not be modeling, assessment of potential water quality impacts of the CalAm project on the MCWD wells and the seawater intrusion front. Is that correct?
Correct. That's correct.
Okay, well, it's probably worth, I hate to open things up, but on the other hand, sometimes these discussions can help focus where you do your presentation. So I'll just start out and ask either Dr. Kincaid or Ms. Nelson, does either of you want to comment on what Mr. Wilkins just said about the challenges of doing these assessments?
Yeah, I can speak to what we've been talking about, and it's a concern that we've raised amongst the both sides experts. It's not so much a criticism about like doing the analysis, but that there will be this is a second level of analysis that is that differs or adds on to the groundwater modeling. So, like for instance, and so and that's partly why A has the 2, potential options there. We talked about solute transport modeling as a way to essentially simulate the distribution of TDS in the groundwater system and how that might change under different conditions. And then also alternatively particle tracking or maybe, coincidentally. So particle tracking could be done directly from the groundwater model. So therefore subject to the exact same tool that, we've spent this time talking about and all of those things. The solute transport modeling would be like another model built on top of the groundwater model that under ideal circumstances would itself be subject to calibration. And for this application, it's doubtful that we'd really be able to do much in the way of calibration in terms of the matching a historical record of salinity movement or TDS movement through the system. And so the only thing that is a concern, or I think should be incorporated into the analysis, is an assessment, like let's call it a self-assessment of uncertainty associated with those predictions. So, and Mr. Wilkins used the error bar idea, but if you could imagine on a map, the map might show how the line between freshwater and saltwater, the concentration front, however you want to look at it, how that might move through time. And what I'm suggesting is that line should really be more of a zone of uncertainty. Like here's where the zone is, now, and this is what we think is going to happen to the zone. But the actual line on the map is likely to be plus or minus some level of uncertainty.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Thank you. Ms. Nelson, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I think that if we do have, if we include some form of a solute transport, it's going to be really critical to look at, for example, if that solute transport is going to be used to assess ocean water percentage or something like that, that it be accurate for the test slant well, but also basically a dumb check on it, which is that we know approximately where the seawater intrusion front is today. And if anything, water levels have been declining in the basin. And so if in fact the solute transport model is run and it shows a much larger extent of seawater intrusion than what we currently have without any additional pumping, then it suggests the solute transport model is unreliable. So I think there needs to be, if we're going to include a solute transport model, there has to be some attempt at demonstrating reliability. And if it's obvious it's wrong, then that needs to be evaluated. And I mean, I may not be able to predict historically how seawater intrusion migrated, but I can tell you that the prior models that I've seen with the solute transport would suggest that the entire Monterey subbasin should be seawater intruded already. And it's not.
So what does that mean? Does that mean
That the model's wrong.
the model's wrong? Okay, that's what I thought that would mean. So
if we're going to use a solute transport model, there has to be some sort of a dumb check that demonstrates it's not totally wrong.
okay. Well, I guess that's certainly something all of you need to work on. Nobody else can do it, but all of you. So, okay, I don't know, does anybody, well, we'll start with Mr. Osias. I was going to ask if any of the CalAm experts wanted to say something about this, but if you want to say something, Mr. Osias, go ahead.
I just had a brief sort of question. The MCWRA came out with an updated seawater intrusion map. It came out after we finished our hearings. So that's an example of information that might be useful. Didn't know what the procedure was for having a right to submit it. But it relates to this question, maybe if we're going to look at where seawater intrusion is, we probably ought to use the most current map.
I certainly don't want to open up the record to a whole bunch of new exhibits, but on the other hand, I think that type of exhibit is clearly relevant to this issue of the assessment of potential water quality impact. So I I mean, I don't know for sure, having not seen it and having not heard whether the other side objects to that, but I wouldn't keep it, I wouldn't avoid offering it just because you're concerned I might not admit it. If you think it's relevant and your experts think it's relevant, you should certainly offer that.
Okay.
So, okay, I'm going to go to
With
Mr.
April,
Leffler.
with the April filings, I guess was the question then also, right? Is that what you
Yes,
want?
yeah, please file it with the April 10 filings. If,
Okay.
if it sounds like it's potentially relevant to that file.
Okay.
All right, so Mr. Leffler, I'll go to you and then back to you, Ms. Nelson. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just be brief. I think, that's something we need to talk about a little bit more with the other side as far as the potential use of a solute transport model. I think, there's, as you might not be surprised, some points that we would disagree on what was just said. And I think there are ways that solute transport modeling could be used effectively here, but, we'll reserve that for further discussions.
Okay. And then Ms. Nelson, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond with regard to the Monterey County Water Resources Agency map. There's actually data that supports that map, which I believe is now available for use. And I would suggest that we use the actual data rather than someone else's interpretation of it.
Well, I'm going to leave that up to you to decide what to do. I'm certainly not going to prohibit the introduction of the data, but a map can be useful, especially for people like me to get an overall picture. And certainly technical experts like you can point out where there are discrepancies between the map and the data. So I'm not going to exclude either one, but certainly if you think there are differences, you should point those out. That's obviously very significant. So thank you. And back to you, Mr. Leffler. But
Sorry, I just forgot to lower my hand.
Okay. All right, thank you. So I'm gonna, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm gonna say it. The court's questions clearly focus on some of the later ones. I think I don't remember the numbers, but the court obviously is very concerned with the potential impacts of the CalAm project on the Marina Coast wells and the seawater intrusion front. So I certainly think that's something that you should focus on with the best available tools you have, considering the amount of time you have and the amount of information and data that are available. So please do that. I just want to say the ocean water percentage thing, I guess that came up in the Coastal Commission proceedings, and potentially in that one of I think there may have been a settlement agreement where that was relevant. I'll just say it seems less relevant to me. I mean, we're doing you are doing all this modeling work, and we're going to get the results of that, and that's going to show project impacts in terms of changes in groundwater levels and so forth. The ocean water percentage to me was always sort of an artificial construct. I mean, the parties apparently agreed to it in some proceedings, but as I know Mr. Leffler pointed this out, that if you have water that's 80% ocean water percentage and 20%, I mean, it's 80% ocean water and 20% fresh water, that doesn't mean it was potable or exactly what it came from. It just means that its salinity is what you would get if you mixed a certain amount of ocean water with a certain amount of fresh water. So none of the court's questions ask about ocean water percentage directly. So I just would say, if you think it's relevant, certainly you can address it if you think it's relevant to the court's issues, but I don't think it really is the focus of where we're going here. And unless you can convince me otherwise, where the impacts on the seawater intrusion front and the MCW wells clearly are what is critical here. So I just want to say that to the extent it helps you decide where to focus your development of your testimony and your written materials. So let me just see whether we're done. Okay, so we've covered that, the outline 9E, which I appreciate. To help you with presenting your testimony, you're preparing and presenting your written proposed testimony and your exhibits. I think it's going to be best if the April 10 presentations really focus on each expert supporting or expressing his or her opinions and, you know, explaining the support for them, describing the modeling work and the outputs of those, rather than, I mean, and I did ask you to submit areas of agreement and disagreement, so I do want you to do that. But I think it's better not at that point to focus on basically critiquing the other side's experts or opinions and so forth, but save that for the April 24th submissions, and primarily because then you'll have on April 10 what they actually filed. I mean, you may have heard them say certain things in meetings and so forth, but I'd rather you focus on critiquing what they actually file, and then, of course, then you can cite to it and explain, witness A says this in paragraph 5. I disagree, and here's why. And I think that'll just make it a lot better organized for direct testimony on April 10 and what I'm going to call rebuttal on April 24th. So are there any questions about that? Okay, so here is my plan. As soon as I can get it out, I'm going to circulate an updated list of the 10 issues that were listed on pages 4 and 5 of my December 21st post-hearing order. Obviously, there need to be some updates. It's pretty clear you're not going to have one consensus model. That may have been wishful thinking on my part, but it's clear that's not going to happen. And then I'm also going to update the list of types of exhibits that was on pages 3 to 4 of my February 6th post-hearing order, to basically reflect the information from the experts' February 17 joint status report and what we've talked about today. In that order, I will direct the parties' experts to prepare an updated joint status report and to file it on March 12. That'll be the Monday before our hearing on Thursday. I hope you have more meetings and can make more progress on consensus items where you can. And I'd like to know about that. And then we'll have the hearing on March 16 where I can ask you questions about the updated report, similar to how I asked questions and we had discussions today. So, and then so I'm going to submit sort of a draft list of model scenarios with the order now, but then after March 16, when I've heard from you on whether you've reached consensus on these model scenarios, what I call the without sigma implementation model scenarios. And then we'll have the final list of scenarios that I'll submit after that. So does anyone have any questions or comments about anything up till now that we've covered? Not, maybe I've worn you all out, and thank you. So I do want to spend a few minutes talking about the text, the proposed text for the draft referees report that I've directed the attorneys to prepare. Any of the parties' expert witnesses, you don't have to stay on if you have other things to do. You're certainly welcome to stay on if you want to, but you're dismissed from today's hearing because the rest of the discussion will just be on the draft referees report. So I guess my first question for the attorneys is, do any of the attorneys have any questions or comments about the parts of my February 6th order on post-hearing order on pages 4 and 5 that discuss the proposed text, or about the draft outline that was attached to that. I know we went over that before, and I got your comments and tried to incorporate them to the extent appropriate. And I think we have a viable outline going forward, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity for any questions or comments if you have any. Mr. Bouchard, go ahead and let me just grab that outline so I have it here. Go ahead.
I don't have any comments on the outline itself. My only comment is on what I'm going to call kind of the phase 1 draft that you asked for. It had included point 3.0, 3.1 and 3.2 in the discussion section, which is field data and analytical calculations and technical work other than modeling. Our experts have a lot to do between now and April, and adequately preparing a draft of those sections is going to require meetings with them. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to take time away from what they're doing with the modeling now. So I would propose just moving the drafts of those 2 parts to after the second hearing. That's my only comment.
Okay, that may make sense. Let me tell you what I was thinking. I was thinking in 3.1 and 3.2, those would be, I'll say, general qualitative descriptions. 3.1 would be basically a description of, here is the data set that's available. Here are the types of data that we have available in the record and that were used by the experts in 3.1. And then in 3.2 would be, here are the types of analytical calculations and technical work besides modeling that the experts did, but not getting into describing the substance of that, because that clearly would be described in what's now part 4 of the outline, where in answer to the court's questions, there would be references to the data and the analytic calculations. Does that help at all, Mr. Bouchard, or is that, and
that's how I understood what you were asking, but it's still going to require meetings with our experts. And as I think you heard today, they're still preparing and trading technical memorandums back and forth leading up to this next round. So we wouldn't even be able to provide a full list of the technical work that's ultimately going to be listed in the final report.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing I'd say is that's subject to revision, but I mean, you do make a good point. I don't know. Does anybody else have any comments on that, particularly anybody from Cal-Am? I assume you're not going to argue with that. So I'll think about that. I do understand what you're saying, Mr. Bouchard, and there's some value to that. I mean, the main thing is I certainly don't want to undermine or take. I'm more than happy to give attorneys assignments in this proceeding, but I don't want to take time away from the technical experts who clearly have a lot to do already. So that it seems like a valid point. Let me give that some thought, but I think that probably is something we can agree to. I did want to point out in my order, there was a typo or a mistake. You probably all figured it out, but on the February 6th post-hearing order, once near the bottom of page 4 and once near the top of page 5, I referred to order WR 2022-0154 twice, and that should be order WR 2022-1052. If you went to our website, which is listed there, you would see that there's not a 154 and there is a 152. But anyway, just so you're clear, just so you're clear, we're clear, that was the order I was talking about there for the sample of kind of the format for how we do this. So, okay, well, that's good. As far as what to put in the draft text, and I am glad that you're going to exchange drafts and then submit your final drafts to the hearings office, to my office. If you read the formats of those orders, I just want to emphasize this again. we really try in our orders to state things objectively and neutrally and not argumentatively. So, and I hope you will do that too. I mean, frankly, otherwise we probably just won't use your text if it gets really argumentative. There was a fair amount of time during our last round of hearings on impeachment, using deposition transcripts for impeaching or attempting to impeach some of the witnesses. And I know that's what you're all used to doing from your court work. But I'll just say, unless there was some impeachment that really got to the foundations of some witnesses' analysis or opinions, I don't think I'm going to want to spend a lot of time in the proposed order on something like, well, witness A said this during the deposition, and then at the hearing, he or she said this, and it was different. And, with the argument that undermines the entire credibility of the witness. I mean, I just don't see that. I'll just tell you, I don't see that happening here. I think all of these technical experts are very qualified and are working very hard to try to do good quality work here. And if there may have been some slight discrepancies between their deposition testimony and their hearing testimony, I'm going to assume, unless proven otherwise, that was just because of maybe not a complete understanding of the question and so forth, rather than that this witness cannot be trusted in any aspect. So I'm just telling you that for what it's worth. And if you think there's something that's really critical, that was really egregious, then you can put it in your text and I'll decide whether or not to put it in there. But I just don't see that being a big part of the proposed report or the draft report I'm preparing. Also, this is just a point I just want to make to alert to the Cal-Am attorneys. There has been a question of whether the work is by Cal-Am's experts or the hydrologic working group experts. And I know Cal-Am has tried to emphasize what was done by the hydrologic working group, but I just want to say, unless there was something that was clearly done by the hydrologic working group, I'm going to refer to it as Cal-Am's experts did this work. I don't think it really affects the credibility, but I don't want to falsely attribute things to the hydrologic working group if they really were done by Cal-Am's experts for this proceeding. So again, please keep that in mind when you are preparing your testimony. And this may have to do with some of the prior models as well. I mean, some of the models clearly were done by the hydrologic working group. I don't think the ones for this hearing were. So don't, make sure you're accurate on making that distinction between those. And then the last thing.
Could I ask a question about that?
Yes, that's mainly for section 2.8 of the outline. Go ahead.
This is Mr. Osias.
Go ahead.
There were over many years submittals to PUC, Coastal Commission, whatever, they authored by the HWG, and you're not suggesting any of those be relabeled. Okay.
No. If it says HWG on the front, it's okay for you to refer to it as HWG.
Okay.
If it says geoscience or, Dr. Ye or Mr. Durbin or Mr. Leffler, it's, one of their exhibits, then please don't call that HWG if there was not an HWG consensus for that. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. And then even for this, okay, I think that's the right rule, but we obviously don't want to go sideways unintentionally. So
I just want it to be accurate. Yeah.
Right. And that certainly at the beginning of this proceeding, the direct testimony and sort of the expert opinions were peer reviewed by the collective. And so I think they thought they were acting as the HWG. This new modeling work, which now has a new label anyway, is, that's easy to not label it HWG.
Okay,
I think
and
we
that's fine,
submitted
Mr.
things.
Osias. All I'm saying is if you're labeling it HWG, just make sure the record shows that that's an appropriate label.
All right, thank you.
And then in section 2.9 of the outline and Dr. Ash's testimony, I'm not sure how relevant the AEM data is going to be to the issues associated with modeling assumptions, which of course is the main thing we're looking at now and we'll be focusing on in the draft report, potentially also for some of these, what I'm going to call the outline 9E issues. But if you think the AEM data is relevant to those issues, I recommend that your text refer to and cite his published technical papers rather than his written proposed testimony. I mean, I'll just say that it was concerning to me that his written proposed testimony, it didn't seem that he really had spent a lot of time preparing that. And there were several places in there where he said, we did this, where it turned out we was other people and did not include him. And I found that to be disturbing and potentially not very accurate. Where on the other hand, I think his peer-reviewed technical papers, which he did authenticate in his testimony, so I think they clearly can be considered part of his testimony and not hearsay. I have more confidence that those, really went through rigorous review and are accurate. So again, I'm just saying that to the extent you want to talk about his work and analysis and conclusions, unless there are reasons to cite to his testimony, I think you're better off citing to his published technical papers. So those were just a couple of comments. I just wanted to help give you some guidance as to where I'm coming from. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm going to take both of the files you prepare, both for the first round and the second round, and I'm sure I will meld them into my draft, which will take parts from each of you, obviously the parts I think are more appropriate. But so since it's my document, that's why I'm being a little, maybe more outspoken than I otherwise would be if it were just closing briefs about how I want you to format and prepare these things. So a little bit of rambling, which I apologize for, but I'll stop there. Are there any questions or comments on any of that? Okay, well, thank you then. And we will plan to meet again on March 16. I think the main purpose will be, it'll probably be shorter than before, but as I said, I will ask for an updated joint experts report to be filed on March 12th, and then for us as necessary to discuss that on March 16th. So anything else for today? Nope. All right. Well, thank you all very much, and I will plan to see you all on March 16th. Have a good day. Bye.
Have a good day.